Okay.
And action. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for coming in. Before we get into the policy questions, I was hoping we could just go through a few personal questions just to get a sense of who you are and give the voters
Sure.
a sense of who you are. So
Sure.
these sound like job interview questions. I apologize. I wonder if you could tell us what do you think has been the most important political development in your life that sort of shaped your understanding of politics?
The most important political development in my life? It would probably be, and I think it's been reported on sort of ad nauseum, 187. I think 187 opened my eyes to a lot of things. I think 187, a few years thereafter, made me to start to think that perhaps, and not necessarily me personally, but the group of friends I was with as activists, maybe someone should run for office, that being on the outside and being perceived as throwing, Molotov cocktails serves a purpose to a certain point, but to getting any foreseeable real change that's sustainable over the course of time, that someone would have to run for office. So I think 187 was a huge political awakening for me.
Mm-hmm. It seems like that issue has been a through line in your political career, the issue of immigration and immigration.
Well, for anyone who strongly supported 187, one of the unintended consequences of 187 was Kevin de León. So.
Is there a political issue that you have changed your mind about over the course of your adult life?
I think the issue of cannabis. The issue of cannabis. This is an issue that I've spoken with Dan Moraine and others on a few occasions. My concerns with regards to cannabis, growing up in a community that was ravaged by issues of crime, drug dealing, and what happened to a lot of folks who I knew personally, and folks I didn't know personally, but were part of the community, and what that would mean for a community that was disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system that dealt with the issue of illicit drugs, whether it be cannabis, whether it be cocaine or crack cocaine, heroin, and other issues. I've always been a supporter of medicinal use of cannabis because of the scientific data, the empirical evidence demonstrating that was very helpful to those who suffered from maladies, whether it be some type of cancer, whether it be AIDS, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, anxiety. The issue of recreational use of cannabis, I had my trepidation, there's no question about it, for the reasons that I have subscribed to, that I think was written in a piece by Dan too, because they were real, they were my feelings. It's the law of the land now. It's constitutional. The people have voted for it. The scheduling of cannabis to be equated with heroin as well as cocaine is unfair. To equate those illicit drugs to cannabis, understanding that it's whether people concur or not, it's going to be a pillar of the economy of California. We have to deal with it through a regulatory framework that's fair, that's just, that provides for public safety, and deals with the issue of the business dealings of the cannabis industry. So that's one of the issues that I've grown over the course of time.
Was there a particular moment when you changed your mind, or was it a gradual kind of shift for you?
I think that engaging with folks from the cannabis industry who had wanted to speak with me too, I was honest with them too about my feelings about the issue, my trepidation. So I'm not going to be viewed or perceived as someone who was on the vanguard of the issue, or someone who sort of kind of caught the wave and was on top of this issue. Some folks may view me, understandably so, as a sort of Johnny-come-lately on the issue, but I try my very best to be thoughtful, on given issues and be as less political as possible.
Either professionally or personally, could you think of a particular mistake that you've made in your life that you've learned from that?
I mean, I've made a lot of mistakes. I've made numerous mistakes, and I think hopefully we grow from our mistakes. I mean, there's been so many, I wouldn't even know how to itemize them. You know, it took a huge list. But I'm not the same person. When I started off as either a senator back in 2010 or as leader, of the California State Senate.
How have you changed?
I think that when you have an opportunity to grow, when you have an opportunity to learn, when you have an opportunity to engage with other folks who are much smarter than you are, folks who have a lot more knowledge, wisdom, experience on a whole variety of issues, to sort of listen and sort of internalize their counsel, their input. I think, and I know it'll be up to folks such as you and others who will write what kind of leader I've been, but I think I have been successful, and I think I have been successful because I've listened a lot to other folks. You may not have seen it, in a very public manner, but I have sat down with folks who are much smarter than I am, less maybe political advice and more so advice on issues, on policy issues that I chose to really go in head first on. And I just grew as an individual. I believe as adults, we're lifelong learners, those who choose to be lifelong learners, and then we grow and we evolve.
So was there a mistake you made as leader that you learned from?
Like I said, I think there have been various mistakes that I've made, as leader, and we grow and we evolve from those mistakes.
Could you name just one of them?
Let me. Probably. I think I wish that maybe I had a little more constructive, positive, relationship with Anthony Rendon. We may have settled on a not maybe such a good note on a whole variety of issues. There's always been the interesting, historic wars between the two houses, the Assembly and the Senate. But I kind of wish maybe we had done things a little bit more differently. He's a good guy. I like him a lot.
If you are elected to the position of U.S. Senator, California would be losing, I believe, the 6th most ranking member in the Senate. It's a body that our seniority goes a long way. Someone who sits at the head of the Judiciary Committee, senior.
Ranking member of the Judiciary Committee.
Excuse me, ranking member, as a high ranking on the Intelligence and Appropriations Committee. And I wonder if you could just, that would mean losing potentially a lot of influence. And so, why should voters give that up? Well,
I'm not too sure if I buy into the premise of your question. I think that seniority means nothing if you don't use that seniority to forcefully move policies that improve the human condition, in this case for all Californians. I think on the issue of intelligence matters, which are her perceived strengths, as well as national security issues, which are her perceived strengths, I think that two colossal mistakes were made. Voting for two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. Both wars have cost taxpayers more than $6 trillion to date, and more importantly have cost easily over 8,000 American lives. The Middle East is not a region that's safer or more stable. In fact, it can be easily argued that it is more unstable and a much more dangerous area in the country. On the issue of national intelligence, just recently voting to allow the American intelligence services to spy on American citizens without a judicial warrant is undemocratic, is un-American. I believe strongly that if you believe that you have the goods on somebody, an individual or an organization, that you go before a U.S. federal judge and you present those goods. A judge is either going to say, give you the green light to move forward with any type of surveillance activity. Judge may say that's not sufficient enough evidence, come back with more proof, or a judge may say this is a complete overreach, this is, you're politicizing your attempts to go after somebody or an individual, an organization. I'm going to deny you that opportunity to remove purportedly an equal branch of government from the equation, the judiciary, and to allow the federal government to have unilateral decision making on spying on American citizens without a judicial warrant is extraordinary, given that this vote was taken with this current administration, the Trump administration. And those are intelligence matters. So if those are the perceived strengths, I think in this case that she has failed in a very incredible way. So going back to the issue of seniority, I don't believe seniority means much if you don't use that seniority.
Okay.
And let me go back. One thing, California is, and I'm sure a question will come up on the issue of climate change and the environment. California is not just the nation's leader, but is the global leader on climate change, and to outsource the leadership for the country in the U.S. Senate to a neighboring state like Oregon through Jeff Merkley is inconceivable to me. We should have that leading national voice originating from California. On the issue of immigration, where we have the majority of all immigrants in the country, legal, naturalized citizens, as well as undocumented, TPS, dreamers, the majority of them are here in California. To outsource that responsibility to the senator from Illinois, Dick Durbin, especially when you're the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, and at one time the chair of the Judiciary Committee, is, again, it's unconscionable that you would be outsourcing those major responsibilities that impact a state like California so much, more than any other state in the country. So going back to the perceived strengths, that being national security and intelligence, I believe that there has been a spectacular failure. Voting for two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, is not just any vote. That's committed American lives, and that's committed American taxpayers to a strategic goal and objective that has yet to be accomplished. And in fact, the end result so far, not the final outcome, has been more instability in that region.
Would you not have voted to invade Afghanistan?
It's a good question, because I've been asked that question on numerous occasions, given the political environment at the time, given 9/11 at that time. I can tell you clearly I would not have voted for the invasion of Iraq. Afghanistan, I don't think I would have voted for Afghanistan. I think there was a tremendous amount of political pressure. There was a tremendous amount of patriotism in the wake of 9/11 and what took place. I think the intelligence was faulty that was provided to the U.S. senators. I think they were sold a bill of goods by the George W. Bush administration and by then the Secretary of Defense. His name's escaping me right now, and the whole Donald Rumsfeld. I think that they were sold a bill of goods. I do believe you lead from a position of strength. I do believe that there is a time when you should intervene. I think that it was a deeply visceral, emotional decision. I believe that the administration had a tremendous amount of pressure that they needed to intervene, they needed to act, they needed to demonstrate to the American people without any sense of hesitation that we'll do everything within their power to protect our American sovereignty, which I agree with. But I think the decision was faulty based on faulty data points that were sold to the U.S. Senate. And it is your duty, your moral and legal responsibility to vet out the information is to the best of your ability. The legislative branch, in this case the U.S. Senate, is not subservient to the executive branch. And oftentimes we often see the blurring of the lines between the co-equal branches of government. I took my duty and responsibility very seriously. as the leader of the California State Senate, that we were not subservient, no matter how popular the current government may be with the rest of the state of California, that this was in fact a co-equal branch of government, and I would act in such a manner. I would take those duties and responsibilities very seriously if given the opportunity to represent the state of California, and if I found myself in a very similar situation.
So, if you were to go from Sacramento to DC, you would be going from a situation where, up until recently, you were leading a party in a body that had supermajority control.
Yes, different
where
dynamic.
people put your name on some of the most high-profile legislation to a body where you'd be a junior member, and where, according to a lot of forecasts, you'd probably be in the minority party. So how would you exert any kind of influence in that environment?
That's a good question, because what you're saying is obviously you're going from a majority, and at one time a supermajority, having the ability to move policies, and not all policies, because there was a time when I had to negotiate with Republicans in terms of the extension of the Global Warming Solutions Act, or I should say cap and trade and Senate Bill 1, to an environment that you are going to be in the minority with a very deeply entrenched culture of seniority and a rigid hierarchy. Mm-hmm. Those are fair points. What I would say is that there is also time for change. This is your grandfather's U.S. Senate. The current system we have today has to change for the people of California, not just for Democrats, but for the people of California, because it simply is not working for the people of California. The historic, most deliberative body in the world, quite frankly, has been deliberating far too long on a whole variety of issues that are not as complex and arcane as people think, but rather requires the leadership necessary to move the policies. If I'm given an opportunity to represent the state of California in Washington, and if I still remained in the minority in Washington, D.C., I would use it as a national platform to move the policies that have been successful in the state of California on the issue of climate change, on the issue of immigration reform. I would use it as a bully pulpit. You can't work within the confines of, I believe, country club rules, because you will continuously year after year after year after year be mired in the same status quo.
What do you mean by country club rules? Are those institutional changes that you would push?
I would push for institutional changes within the institution itself. Listen, members can't bring certain bills to, not certain bills, bills to the floor without a 3/5 approval. It's 60 votes to the floor. They already eviscerated the nuclear option now with regards to the nomination, or not the nomination, but the confirmation of a U.S. Supreme Court justice now. There's no 3/5 requirement now, but there is 3/5 requirement to bring policy to the floor itself.
Would
In
you
the
have
California,
done that when you were Senate leader here? Would you have let Republicans who were in the minority bring bills to the floor if they didn't have a chance of passage?
But that's different, because we don't have a 3/5 supermajority requirement in the California State Senate. It's a simple majority. In the simple majority, as a consequence of elections, based on the power and the value of their ideas manifested in their piece of legislation, it either made it to the floor or not. Believe it or not, there's been quite a few Assembly bills and Senate bills, Republican bills, that have made it through our Senate
Sure,
floor.
but most of them get killed in committee, so it's just a different way of the majority party doing
No,
the same thing.
let me just make a slight correction. When I said make it to the floor, that means they actually made it through fiscal and made it through policy committee to get it to the floor. There's been quite a few Republican measures that I voted for in the past week when we had all the measures coming through both respective houses. With the hopes of getting to the governor's desk. There are a lot of Republican bills that I voted for. So I would want to sort of kind of dispel the myth a little bit that every single Republican bill that's a Senate bill or Assembly bill is killed immediately. Of course, if there's certain bills that run contrary to my values, I'm not going to either A, vote for it, or B, depending on the controversy of the issue itself, I'm not going to move the bill forward. But we don't have no artificial barriers in terms of a almost supermajority 3/5 60 vote requirement which I believe is foolhardy. Bring it to the floor and have a debate on the issues. Vote up or down on the issue. I believe that's how democracy works.
Do you think the U.S. Senate should get rid of the filibuster entirely?
Well, I won't go that far right now. I won't go that far right now. But I think there are certain things in U.S. Senate that we must take a look at. I mean, because it's the U.S. Senate, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is still working today. The United States has changed dramatically. A state like California, as innovative and creative that we are, we have a spirit of disrupting the status quo and the establishment authority, and not pushing the envelope, but tearing the envelope apart. So I think it's healthy. I think it is a good thing for an institution that has been very rigid in its traditions and its customs and practices to sort of take a step back and reassess, does this institution still work for the American people? I think it's a healthy thing to do. So that's more of an internal process issue, which I think is very healthy, I think.
All right. You alluded to this a second ago, I think, but could you point to a moment in your legislative career where you've brought different groups together from different political factions or different political viewpoints, where you've had to be the sort of bipartisan?
Yeah, I think it was the issue of wage theft for janitors. I brought men and women, primarily immigrant men and women who work some of the hardest jobs. When you guys leave this office building, they're the ones who come in and they're the ones who clean up after everybody. Wage theft has been a huge issue. The Chamber of Commerce had that bill that was killed a year prior by another author. It was on the list of a job killer. I worked, the union came with me, SEIU, specifically the USWW janitors and security officers. They asked me if I would carry the bill. I was leader at the time. I had a few standards that I conveyed, that I would only carry the bill if we sat down with the California Chamber of Commerce. That wouldn't be a ram job just because I'm leader of the California State Senate and with that political capital, that I would take this measure and I would just jam it right through. That we'd have to sit at the table with the California Chamber of Commerce and other employer organizations. It was long, it was tedious, it wasn't easy, but at the end of the day, if you were to ask the janitors, SEIU specifically, and if you ask the California Chamber of Commerce and the employer groups that they represented, there is mutual satisfaction in how we got that bill across the finish line and actually onto the governor's desk with the signature. So that was a case in point where we did get individuals from very diametrically opposing interest, that it was at one time a job killer bill, and it wasn't that the bill was so diluted that it was off the job killer list, but now the janitors were angry and upset because I believe it had no teeth. Okay, we got a bill now, but now, it's been removed from the job killers list, but now we got a shell of a bill, it means nothing to us. They were happy and satisfied. You can call them up, and I'd have to ask my staff who the employer organizations are, and the point person for the California Chamber of Commerce, they were satisfied as well too. So those were two diametrically opposed individuals. I wish I could say on the issue of climate change, but it's been a little more, there was a lot of coalition building, but if you were, but not the right coalition perhaps is amplified as I wish it would be, on the issue of climate. That's one instance right there.
We wanted to talk about the Brett Kavanaugh situation. Last week, you called it a failure of leadership when we learned that Dianne Feinstein had this letter accusing him of harassment, but had not said anything about it until last week. But there's been some developments over the weekend, and the alleged victim has come forward and shared her story. And so I'm just wondering, how are you feeling today compared to last week? I mean, do you feel any differently now that we know more about the alleged incident and the woman's desire for privacy?
Let me take a step back and sort of give a little background before the allegations from Christine Ford. Number one, I've been on the record from day one that Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation to the U.S. Supreme Court would be the biggest threat in a generation to women's right to choose, on workers' rights, on voting rights, on civil rights, on our environmental laws, and that I opposed his nomination, his confirmation to the U.S. Supreme Court. Mathematically, the Democrats were going to have a very challenging time stopping this nomination moving forward from both the Judiciary Committee with 11-10 split between Republicans and Democrats, and on the floor itself. I go back to the way Neil Gorsuch was confirmed in a quite seamless manner, and then how Merrick Garland was treated without even the respect that he deserved as a nominee, with a sitting president of the United States of America, to even have an audience, with the members of the U.S. Senate, and more specifically, the Republicans. So here we have Brett Kavanaugh, who I've already have stated I oppose, and for the following reasons. So how would they derail, if you will, stop this nomination? Well, after finding out that the ranking member of the U.S. Senate had possession of this letter, I believe it was quite possible, it was in fact possible, to deal with this issue, if not publicly, privately, and keep the confidentiality of Christine Ford. We're talking about the Judiciary Committee of the U.S. Senate. They handle sensitive, highly classified materials and documents. They redact people's names and identification. If you can't do that in the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate, then I would ask, what are you capable of doing? If not engaging on the issue before the open public hearing, which Grassley chaired, at least when you have a one-on-one with the nominee himself in private, that wasn't even broached. Now, this became open because obviously there was a leak or a series of leaks in Washington. Now, we don't know if it was Feinstein's office or someone else's office, but there were leaks happening right now, and the pressure started to build up. And before the press was going to go with their to the press, or to the printers or online, they made it clear that they had possession of the letter. So they were pressured. It wasn't something that came out freely by the Feinstein operation or the staff. These are very serious allegations. I think they're cause enough for a delay in the committee hearings to get to the bottom of it, to find out the veracity of the allegations themselves. But I don't believe it was handled correctly. I believe that Christine Ford's confidentiality could have been kept, and at the same time, this issue could have been dealt with. But it was neither. And it wasn't until the pressure mounted because of the press, because of the leaks, that they started acting on the issue itself.
So no change in position from last week? I mean, you still, even knowing her story, the details of it, her desire for confidentiality?
Let me just revalidate. I think that I respect her request to keep it confidential. I want to be very clear about that. I respect that very much. And if I were in that position, I would honor her confidentiality, her identity as well too. It is very difficult for any individual who purportedly has been sexually assaulted to open up. I respect that, and it's something that I would adhere to as well too. Not politicize it, respect that. At the same time, how do you deal with this issue? Do you sit on it for 2 months, and all of a sudden through the leak, the pressure mounts, and all of a sudden you have to act on the issue itself? I don't think it was handled greatly. And again, let me go back. If this is the Judiciary Committee, the U.S. Senate, and this is the ranking member, and you're dealing with countless sensitive materials and documents, some confidential, if you can't deal with an issue such as this, with redacting the name and keeping the confidentiality of the individual, I don't know what you can do. Okay. When she gave the letter to the Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, and it actually made its way to the senior senator, I made the assumption that she wanted some type of action. that for informational purposes was to give you insight or an idea to Brett Kavanaugh's character. It wasn't just, I want to give this to you and don't do nothing about it. I'm giving it to you, there's a purpose and objective behind it. How you handle it, is another thing altogether.
So let's talk about how you handled a sensitive situation that came up when you were the leader.
Okay.
When it was publicly reported that Tony Mendoza was being accused of sexual harassment, you said you had no idea
Correct.
that there were those accusations against him, no idea, and yet you were the chair of the Rules Committee that was in charge of overseeing an investigation of him that had already been underway for several weeks. And you also were his housemate. So was that a failure of leadership on your part?
Well, I thank you very much for the housemate, correction, because it's the way it's always been purported in the press. There was an internal failure within our system in terms of sharing information, in knowing and understanding the allegations. Once it was brought to my attention, I immediately acted. And those actions were to take an institution that since 1850 handled the allegations of sexual harassment, sexual assault under the old HR rules. And I changed that system, and we outsourced any type of investigation to an independent group of lawyers who would handle it, free from any political influence, free from the Rules Committee itself. Establish a 1-800 hotline where staff members and others could utilize that 1-800 hotline, and the veracity of any type of allegation would be vetted and would be checked.
But you maintain that you were unaware of this, even though you were the chair of the Rules Committee and the guy's housemate. You were unaware.
Unaware, absolutely.
So where was
There-
that a failure of your leadership that you didn't know this was happening?
Well, I wish that information would have been brought to my attention. That's different than having
Was it staff
documents or
failure?
information. Let me just finish. That's different than having information and documents within your reach that you're aware of, understanding you have something that is happening under your watch, that you have that information within your possession, and not acting on the issue. As soon as I knew, immediately I acted on that issue. And we're the only legislative body in the country, in the nation, there's no other state legislative body, nor in Washington, D.C., that actually outsources its internal investigations on any claims of sexual harassment or assault to an independent legal body who they themselves, free from any type of political influence, commits the investigation and comes to the conclusion and moves forward with the information to the Senate itself. So we're the only body in the country.
Okay. So one more follow-up on that issue, the whistleblower bill that, when you were leader, there was a bill that died several times that would have given whistleblower protections to legislative employees. Eventually, after this whole Me Too movement erupted, it did pass, but it was held many times when you were the leader. So can you just tell the public why that bill was held in your house?
That bill at the time that was held in the House had nothing to do with sexual harassment. It had nothing to do with sexual assault. And obviously, in this instance, the Republican Assemblywoman who carried this measure included it in her measure, and at that time we moved the bill forward and we voted for it. But every attempt to move that measure forward never had any provisions with regards to anyone who would be sexually assaulted or sexually harassed.
But it was
And I think
about
that's a major
misconduct.
difference.
I mean, wouldn't that cover?
I think
those
now that
things?
we have very specific language there that spoke to the issue, that's when we moved the bill forward, and now it's law of the land because we passed it out of the House.
Can I return to a question about Kavanaugh for a moment? Just from a pure standpoint of political tactics, isn't it more likely that this revelation coming out now, just before the committee vote, has a better chance of derailing Kavanaugh than it would have if it had come out earlier?
Through a tact, if you're getting political now, You
It's
can,
purely
you know,
political
and through tactics as a Hail Mary pass or 11th hour attempt to derail this nomination, this nominee. I couldn't tell you because with the possession of the letter 2 months ago, during the course of the hearing that was televised before the country, the issue could have been broached. Also, too, in a private meeting, the issue could have been broached. Also, too, it was neither. So we don't know. It's neither here nor there because, quite frankly, we don't know. The information was there. The information sat for 2 months, and it didn't break out until there was pressure from the media itself. If there was no pressure from the media itself, there's a high probability that no one would have known that this information existed.
If it had come out when the letters first was received by Feinstein and issued, and the woman was insisting upon anonymity
Of course,
at that time,
yeah.
wouldn't it have just been simply dismissed? Because if she was unwilling to testify or make it public at that time, what it would have been said, what is there? There's nothing there without her name on it, is there?
There could have been a possibility, but I don't know. That's again. I'm going to go back, Dan. It's neither here nor there. We don't know. We don't know the situation. I have not spoken with
No,
Christine
you
Ford
criticized
herself.
Senator Feinstein for not doing it then, in June, when she had the letter, and waiting until now to do it. I'm just asking, maybe it has a better chance of derailing Kavanaugh now than it would have been then if it had been said something about it without the identity of the woman being known.
I think that's something we're not going to know. That's a presumption to make, that without knowing.
Could I just, to be specific, it sounds like what you would have done differently is share the letter with the committee in a redacted form in July. Is that what you would have done differently, or?
As a ranking member, I think it'd be my duty and responsibility, along with my colleagues on the Judicial Committee, to say we have another set of information that has been brought to light. Now, being sensitive and highly confidential, we have to protect the identity of this individual until she feels comfortable, if in fact she ever gets to the point of feeling comfortable in moving forward with this allegation that took place, 3 decades ago. I think you have that responsibility to deal with this issue in a fair and just way.
So you would have given the redacted letter to the committee?
I would have, yeah.
Do you believe that the Republicans had some sense that this was coming? Because they did suddenly, very quickly, bring out testimonials from other women and other classmates of Mr. Kavanaugh from the time.
It's hard to tell if the Republicans knew that this specifically was coming, as opposed to if they believed tactically that something would come up, anything would come up, and therefore they did a preemptive move in terms of acquiring the testimonies of individuals, women specifically from his high school days, from his judiciary days on the D.C. Court of Appeals, working in the White House, and other personal friends and family members, and just having it, on ice in the event if something were to spring like today, and then release that information of testimonies.
If in fact it turns out within the next few days or next couple of weeks or whatever that this allegation does in fact derail Mr. Kavanaugh, wouldn't Senator Feinstein feel justified in claiming it as a victory on her part, as an evidence of being an effective leader?
Well, I don't view it that way, because the information wasn't released until the media themselves put the pressure, and then the information was released. So I wouldn't view it that way. I think the premise of your statement is based on a cold, calculated move to release it by a certain time to have the most maximum effect. I don't think that's the case in this case. The case here is that the news media themselves and various media outlets found out about it, they found about the leak, and they put the pressure, and they had to quickly move towards damage control, and then that's when they released it. So the premise of your question or statement is based on a very shrewd, calculated political move to get maximum effect. In this case,
Senator Feinstein's not capable of a shrewd, calculated.
no, I'm not saying that. You said that. I'm not saying that. But
Can I ask you a little bit about gun control? You've carried gun control measures, and obviously it's a signature issue of Senator Feinstein. Is there any difference between what you would envision doing in the U.S. Senate as opposed to what she's done?
I think we share similar values on the issue of gun safety, ammunition safety. Her signature piece of legislation is the assault weapons ban in 1994. And going back to the issue of seniority, she was elected in 1992, which demonstrated it was 2 long years of seniority that were accumulated in the U.S. Senate to secure a major assault weapons ban. So we'll move that to the side right there. There was no seniority that was needed at the time. This was a signature piece of legislation that since then expired 10 years thereafter. So every year thereafter, every decade thereafter, we've had no measures move forward. One may argue that given the composition of the House as well as the U.S. Senate, it poses challenges to move forward any reauthorization or any type of new legislation. Fair enough. But for someone like me, who it's also very personal, and the reason how I got into the issue of gun safety and ammunition safety is I started thinking about this in a very different way, because California has among the most restrictive gun laws in America, if not the most restrictive gun laws in America. Yet we still have a large number of senseless murders that take place. The vast majority of murders don't take place by assault weapons. The vast majority of murders take place by handguns. Assault weapons sell newspapers. And assault weapons, when we have large number of killings, whether it's Las Vegas, whether it's San Bernardino, Parkland, or the tragedy in Newtown, Sandy Hook, those capture the imagination of the American public. But the vast majority of those who are murdered on a daily, on a weekend basis, are murdered by handguns. And the number of those who are victims of handgun murders dwarf the number of those from assault weapons. So my thesis was focusing on ammunition, because ammunition to me is it's the oxygen that fuels the violence. Without ammunition, a handgun, a long gun, a shotgun, a semi-automatic weapon, an assault weapon ceases to function without the fuel, the oxygen, which are bullets. In California at the time, you could call the Attorney General, Jerry Brown. You could call the District Attorney, Alameda County, Sacramento County, LA County, any other county, and ask them who sells ammunition, who buys ammunition, and they couldn't give you an answer because no one had that information. There was no, I could walk out of San Quentin Prison or Chino, Folsom, or if I was really bad, from Pelican Bay. And although I was on a list of prohibited class members, I could walk into any gun store, Big Five, Walmart, mom and pop, bait tackle store, and load up and buy all the ammunition I want, no questions asked. There wasn't even a perfunctory question that had to be asked. I need to ask you this. Are you part of a prohibited class? Are you a felon? That didn't even exist, where someone would have the opportunity to just outright lie and says, of course I'm not, and purchase all the ammunition. Well, we've changed that now in California. The difference, I believe, is not just on your values or the issue of your votes, but the issue in terms of organization. To me, to get the handgun ammunition regulation moved forward, I spent 8 years. I spent 8 to 10 years on this issue. And I was sued by the National Rifle Association, by a Superior Court judge in Fresno, went to an appellate court. I continued to work on this issue. Being at the national level, we're not an island unto ourselves, no matter how progressive California may be, how innovative we may be. There are some deeply cultural fissures, if you will, still with a state like California, even though we have demonstrated, empirically speaking, that we do good on a variety of issues, and that other states, in particular red states, could benefit if they tried similar policies. But I would work, for example, with other states. In anticipation of an assault weapons ban, you just cannot introduce a piece of legislation for the reauthorization of the assault weapons ban. S-84, S-85, and just submit it, knowing the political makeup of what the Senate is like. So you want to work with other like-minded individuals to, in state legislative bodies, the state of Oregon, the state of Washington, the state of Illinois, who don't have assault weapons ban, and those are primarily blue states right there. How do you work with them in their legislative bodies so that you create this coalition that you start building from outside coming to the nation's capital? And that takes time, that takes energy, that takes organization. It just doesn't take me submitting a bill, putting it across the desk, and now I can say to the American public or to California voters, I have a bill to reauthorize the assault weapons ban. It takes much more than that. It's about organization. It's about traveling all over the state of California. And if it's very similar to Senate Bill 1234. I won't deviate unless you ask me the question of retirement security, but given the opportunity, I'll tell you. Because it's not about just the policy of retirement security. It's how I got it done, which is very key and very insightful, of getting major groundbreaking legislation that will truly help the California people and could potentially help the American people. How do you get this piece of legislation? Do you just slap your name on the idea, you put the language and put it across the desk, and we'll see what happens if we get it up or we get it down? There's a lot more work, and that's beyond the pay grade of legislators or members of the U.S. Senate or members of Congress, traveling to Washington, D.C. 5, 6, 7 times, meetings that were not publicized, meetings with then former Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis, former Secretary of Labor, Tom Perez, trying to persuade them to understand that they need to change the laws, not change the laws, change the regulatory framework, knowing that the Republicans controlled both the House as well as the Senate, knowing there would be no statutory change on the issue of retirement security because of ERISA, knowing that Wall Street disproportionately played a huge role in Washington, D.C., that they would easily influence the members of Congress who were in control, in this case, the Republican members, and that any change to ERISA would never, ever, ever be made as long as they're in control. Because this was a truly public policy issue that impacted Trump supporter, Bernie supporter, as well as Hillary Clinton supporter, the issue of retirement security, and just having someone retire with a modicum of dignity and respect. So it's going back and forth to Washington, D.C., meeting with folks in the regulatory framework. The point I want to make on the issue of the differences between, on the gun policy issue, on ammunition policy issue, it's not just about submitting a bill, but it's how you submit the bill and how you work and amplify your coalition around the country. Right now, the leaders in Washington, D.C., on the issue of gun safety are not the adults on either side of the party. Right now, the leaders are the students from Parkland and other like-minded students like them throughout the country and throughout California. They are truly the leaders. I thought, like everyone else thought, when we saw the massacre of Sandy Hook, that would be a watershed moment in America, that would be the moment that the country would come together. The NRA, what they did is they doubled, tripled, quadrupled down, even more so. When we lost, the 23 plus souls, these beautiful souls, I really truly thought that would be the watershed moment for America, and it was neither. And so they play hardcore. They play power politics. It's not emotional politics. It's not an accumulation of the data of the murders. They don't care. So it's about how do you build this coalition nationwide to put the pressure, the external game, for the internal game.
So the difference between you and Feinstein is not on policy, but
on the issue of that specifically, yeah.
On gun control, it is about your view that you'd be better at building a coalition. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. It's been through my accomplishments and through my record. And I can't say I know what her policy views are overall on the issue of guns. I know what they are on assault weapons, on ammunition. I haven't heard her speak to the issue of ammunition, on high capacity magazines, on the number of weapons that are sold on a daily, weekly, or transactional basis. For example, the states of Nevada and the states of Arizona, you have to engage with the members from those areas, because as restrictive as our gun laws are, when you have a gun show in Nevada, specifically in Reno, down the I-80 corridor where you can buy as many weapons as you want with no NICS background check. Our Department of Justice in California is much more restrictive than the NICS operation in Washington, D.C. You have to go through the 10-day waiting period, as you know. You can go to Reno and buy all the weapons you want. You get on the I-80, you go through Lake Tahoe, through Truckee, you come all the way down to Sacramento, you sell your weapons in Sacramento, then you go down the 99 to Fresno, and you go down the I-80 into the Bay Area, and you sell all the weapons that you want that have been purchased legally. The same thing goes for Las Vegas down the I-15 corridor. The same thing goes for the I-10 corridor from Phoenix, Arizona into the state of California. I would work, for example, with the Attorney General of the state of California and say, we need to sue the states of Nevada and Arizona. Based on our restrictive gun laws, lawful purchases of weapons are being made in gun shows in these respective states, yet they're ending up in the state of California. And that's why I'm saying you have to think about this differently. It's not just, I just submitted a bill, S whatever, and then I just submitted, and then we just watch it, accumulate dust in Washington, D.C.
All right. Let me ask you two water questions. One about
Water.
Cadiz.
Yes.
Feinstein obviously has made a big stand as it relates to Cadiz. I'm not sure exactly what your position is
On the project itself,
On
I
the
have
project.
not taken a position on the project, neither
Why
in
not?
support
What is your
or
position?
opposition. I don't have a position on the project itself. I have not opposed it, nor have I supported the Cadiz water project at all. I know that there are strong elements. I have friends actually on both sides, on both labor as well as environmentalists are on this issue. They're in opposition with each other. I haven't taken a position on Cadiz.
Why not?
Because I've been doing SB 100, I've been doing all these other measures, I've been trying to figure out, I've been campaigning up and down the state of California. So to date, I haven't taken it.
Senator Feinstein is adamantly opposed to tearing down O'Shaughnessy Dam and emptying Hetch Hetchy. What's your view on Hetch Hetchy?
Well, Hetch Hetchy is very interesting. Hetch Hetchy is obviously the water supply to the Bay Area and specifically to San Francisco. I think it was wrong what happened with Hetch Hetchy, from day one. It is sort of the Owens Valley's version, LA DWP, Chinatown, the Owens Valley version of San Francisco and the environmental disaster that has happened in that neck of the woods right there. It's there, it's not going to be moved right there, but if I had to do it otherwise, there'd have to be another stream of water coming in an area that didn't environmentally damage,
Well,
that
do you
area.
think the dam should be torn down and Hetch Hetchy restored at this point?
We would have to find out what would that stream of you have, 1 million, individuals who live in the city and county in San Francisco, and you'd have to make sure that the people of the city in San Francisco have a stream of water that they can rely on. So I think that I would be open as long as we know where that water is coming from and it's cost effective for the people of San Francisco.
So it's not an unequivocal no.
It's not an equivocal no, because I'd want to make sure that we have a stream of water, or it's coming from specifically, and that it's cost effective for the people of California. The people of San Francisco, I should say, the people of San Francisco.
But on Cadiz, again, there was a bill that would have blocked the Cadiz project that died when you were in your house, when you were the Senate leader. And in doing so, you're sort of siding against Feinstein, who really wanted that, but aren't you also siding with Donald Trump?
Not at all whatsoever. That was a process issue. I'm sure that measure will move in January, and I have no doubt that the measure will be successful as it moves. When you have a gut and amend on the measure in the last minute, and you are circumventing or undermining CEQA, and then when they were sued and litigated, it went to a 3-court appellate judge, and then it was still reconfirmed by the 3-judge appellate court. To undermine CEQA and to have a battle among competing interests and to have it legislated in the state Senate and the state legislature in the last minute is not it's not proper. It's not appropriate to do that. This is a measure that you should introduce from day one, have it go through all the respective policy committees on both sides of the houses, and see what the outcome is. I believe that the measure itself I'm being political right now. I believe the measure itself, if they introduce it in January, will probably be successful. But it's important to sort of bifurcate process and the issue with regards to the policy itself,
Right, but
and
you
having
said you
folks.
didn't have a position on the
Yeah.
policy, which seems like kind of, some might look at that as a sort of mark on your environmental record, since environmentalists are very heavily in favor of blocking that project.
Well, I don't live in a world of absolutes either. I mean, there are some folks who are not happy because I've taken 35% cap and trade dollars and invested in communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. There were folks who were not happy when I moved forward, AB 31, which took money away from purchasing large 300, 200 acres of pristine land that was 3 or 4 miles away from regular city folks who can enjoy Mother Nature, and reprioritize the dollars and say, we're going to use this in urban areas where there are no parks and no open space. It was not, a homogeneous, it's not a homogeneous community, the environmental world, and not everyone is happy on the issue of cap and trade. I've had criticisms from the environmental community, specifically from the environmental justice community, who've been strong, staunch supporters of me, for a very long time, and I think still are staunch supporters of mine. They were not happy. They demonstrated that unhappiness with me on numerous occasions. But I think I made cap and trade a little more responsive and better for them, making sure that we take the 35% of auction revenues and then we invest it in those communities that are disproportionately impacted. So I don't live in a world of absolutes, and I have made decisions that have upset those who are very highly supportive of me. So those are the decisions that you make when you're in a position of influence as a policymaker, to do your best to move the policies that you think at that moment are the right thing to do.
Okay.
You can't get everything that you always want.
So that's actually a good segue. Just kind of a broad question for you about climate change. You said is one of your top priorities.
Uh-huh.
Are there lessons that you take from California, from your legislative experience here, that you would take with you to DC?
Climate change is real. Climate change is deadly, and climate change is extraordinarily expensive. It took me to leave California to go to Australia to learn more about water policy issues about California than my years in the legislature. Australia went through 12 years of a historic drought until the environmental impacts forced the political parties, both on the left as well as the right, to come to some sort of a common agreement because the economy was in danger of imploding altogether. They have had wildfires in the southeast part of Australia. We've had wildfires, which used to be seasonal. Now they're year-round. So if we don't do something about this immediately, we will see a continued deterioration. And the one thing that's, now I'll get to your question, but the one thing that's really critical to understand that the most amount of metric tons of carbon dioxide that have been removed from the environment altogether has been through the renewable portfolio standard. Our utilities, both the munis as well as the private investor-owned utilities, accounted for at one time for 50% of the carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Today they account for 19%, approximately 19%. So decarbonizing the grid is actually low-hanging fruit because it's within reach. The more difficult decisions will be made with regards to the tailpipe emitters. That accounts for roughly about 40% right now of tailpipe emitters as well as goods movement, transportation goods movement in California. So decarbonizing the grid, to do what we need to do, this is low-hanging fruit. Let me be very clear about that. This is within reach. We've gone from 0 to 20% when all the naysayers said we would destroy the economy, the unemployment would rise. We went from 20 to 33%. With then Republican Governor Schwarzenegger issued an executive order. Then I took it from 33 to 50%, and it sent a very clear market signal with standards. This is what we hit. We have to hit there by the year 2030. We'll give the IOUs credit where credit is due through their procurement, process decision making. They are close to blowing through 50%, 10 years ahead of schedule. We believe by the year 2020, most of the 3 IOUs, I know at least one of the IOUs will easily be at 50% by the year 2020. They'll be 10 years ahead of schedule. So now I made the decision to move that up to 2026, 50%, 60% by the year 2030, and obviously 100% by the year 2045. So what we're doing in California works because it's driven by necessity, not by ideology. So if given an opportunity to be a voice for California and represent the people of California in Washington, D.C., understanding that climate change in itself is not regional, but it's a global issue, I would work very closely with my Republican counterparts. I can't tell you how many Republican colleagues I have that pull me to the side and say, Kevin, I'm not this Neanderthal that you think I am. I believe in the science of climate. I don't believe that the earth is flat. You know, it's just difficult for me to come out publicly and openly for this because I'm fearful of being primaried out. So that being said, there are Republicans who do believe in this issue. There are Republicans who want to do something on this issue. And if given this opportunity, I've talked about in my campaign about exporting California values to Washington, not the other way around,
Right.
you know, or moving the nation's capital, you know, to California as well. We should establish it here because we dare to be innovative. We dare to not just adhere to the status quo, because the status quo from the East Coast, specifically from Washington, D.C., has not been working for none of us. So working with red states and working on the economics, working on how you can actually grow an economy in this space, put people to work, reduce your greenhouse gases and other criteria pollutants that our children breathe into their lungs every single day that cause these negative public health outcomes with regards to asthma and other respiratory diseases, that you can actually grow this economy. This issue of climate change and what we've done in California is not ideological in the sense that it is not a democratic value. It's not a progressive value. It just happens to be that at this moment in time and space in our history, we believe in science and facts. And those science and facts help inform our decision making to move forward with policies that even in a blue state like California have not been easy.
Sure.
They've been very
In
difficult.
terms of the policies that you could, I mean, beyond exporting our values, which policies could you export to DC? Maybe you talk about the low-hanging fruit.
Decarbonizing our grid.
That'd be the low-hanging fruit you talk about.
Decarbonizing our grid, transportation electrification, how we demographize climate change benefits. I think that, for example, for those regions, whether it's been West Virginia, whether it's been Kentucky, whether it's been Pennsylvania, whether it's been Ohio, or the coal-producing state in the country, Wyoming for specific, I think that politicians in those areas have failed their constituents. If you're a coal miner, and your father was a coal miner, and your father's father was a coal miner, and this is what you know, and this is what you understand, because it pays your bills, it puts the food on the table, and it puts the clothes on your children's back, then any threat to your livelihood is a threat to you and your family and your children. And you'll do anything and everything within your power to protect your livelihood, even if it's in the thermal coal industry, which is a basic human element that doesn't make a difference if you're on the left or the right, which is completely understandable. I think that the elected officials in those specific areas, whether state legislators or members of the Congress, have failed their constituents because they have should have understood quite easily, because all the evidence is there, the data is there. These are going to be very environmentally challenging times in our region, but at the time, how do we convert these environmental challenges into real economic opportunities? How do we start transitioning, and how do I fight and make sure that I get jobs for my folks so they're not unemployed, instead of holding on desperately to an industry today that is dying. And right now we're witnessing climate change in action with regards to Hurricane Florence that have hit 2 very red states, both North Carolina and South Carolina. We've seen what Harvey did in Texas. We've seen what Maria has done in Puerto Rico. We've seen the Mendocino fires, Sonoma fires, we've seen the Napa fires, we've seen the fires in Southern California. This is costing us tens of billions of dollars out of our pocket. And many politicians are still playing the violin like Nero while Rome is burning. We have to be smart about how we're doing this. And some of the criticisms, and understandably so, has been, well, this is an elite thing. This is an elite thing. This is the coastal folks moving their policies that only certain individuals will benefit from. Okay, fair enough. But since I took on this issue of climate change, what I have attempted to do is change the face of climate change and move forward economic growth policies, equating them to real jobs that can't be outsourced to right-to-work state or offshore to Guangzhou, China, or elsewhere. What I've tried to do is democratize the benefits of climate change, so not just someone who has high educational attainment in the financial wherewithal can have a house in Land Park, for example, that's energy efficient, that has rooftop distributed generation, that have their own charging station in the garage, and have a beautiful Tesla product in the garage, and energy storage. Because if only folks, for example, in Land Park, if they're the only ones who have the financial wherewithal to receive the benefits of the latest and greatest in clean technologies, then we'll never ever meet our macro target goals scientifically to lower carbon dioxide and the consequential impacts it'll have on humanity as we know it today. That's why you have to move the policies with the force of intentionality and the force of law. You can't just do it through an executive order or through an aspirational goal. You have to use it, you have to move it statutorily with intentionality, a sense of purpose, with real benchmarks, and with the hope that we will be able to meet those benchmarks, because if you don't, then we're going to be in a world of hurt, for this state and for this country. And that's why I believe that exploring our California values, especially on the issue of climate change, how we can convert these environmental challenges into real economic opportunities. Hell, if that means flying the red, white, and blue in Old Glory on top of a wind turbine, or putting on a solar array, utility scale panels, then go for it. If it makes making climate change a patriotic issue, that's fine. But we're dealing with this false sense of patriotism and ideology on an issue that's scientific, but actually it's no longer scientific. The issue of climate change is not scientific. The issue of climate change now is political, because we have all the data, and we have a room today of Nobel Prize winners. It doesn't make a difference any longer. The issue now is, as leaders, Democrats and Republicans alike, how we act on this issue in unity to save our country and to save the world.
Great. Thank you for that. I just want to ask you a quick question about immigration, because I know we're
Okay, I'll take the time as what you want.
Okay, so earlier this year, it seems like a really long time ago, there was this compromise legislation between Senators Graham and Durbin that would have made DACA permanent, but in exchange for providing some more funding for border security, including a border wall or fence or whatever you want to call it, and eliminating the diversity lottery.
Eliminating the
diversity lottery. That bill was effectively killed by opposition from the White House, but I'm wondering if that is a bill that you would support, or if there are other kinds of compromises that you're
Well,
making.
I have a lot of respect for Dick Durbin. I don't know him personally, but from what I have witnessed from afar, I have a lot of respect for him and his leadership. Lindsey Graham is a very interesting fellow, but I respect the fact that he's willing to reach across the aisle. But I think the issue of immigration is a Republican issue as well, and not in a negative sense, but it's an issue that they should be dealing with equally, not just Democrats alone. So I don't want to give credit just for waking up in the morning and brushing your teeth, and you should get credit. So I don't know every single detail of the issue of the compromise between Lindsey Graham and Dick Durbin. I do know this, is that whether it's every nation, including ours, has a right to protect our own sovereignty. There's no argument right there. Every nation in the world has the right to remove any individual who's a violent criminal felon, who came here under circumstances that were not normalized, and if they commit a violent felony, a crime of some sort, should not be in our country. They should do their time. They shouldn't get a free pass and be deported, which I've disagreed with, even with law enforcement. Law enforcement and county sheriffs and specifically have wanted to detain you and then remove you, which to me was a get out of free jail card. Why wouldn't you prosecute them and then have them do their time if in fact convicted? and then at that time they're removed from the country. Why give them a free jail card, which was part of the argument in Senate Bill 54, which I was very surprised that the media never really latched onto, is that they were issuing these get out of free jail cards to folks, just commit a crime, the allegation, and have you removed from the country, that makes no sense at all whatsoever, what the arguments from the county sheriffs were using. But that being said, I believe in sovereignty, in protecting our sovereignty. I believe that with regards to DACA, we should protect them. I always believed that this would have been undermined by the White House. That's why I had very little confidence when the president brought the interested parties together, and when we witnessed when Senator Dianne Feinstein was sitting next to the president, and then on another occasion on the issue of guns after the Parkland massacre. I knew instinctively that there would be no deal, and this was more window dressing, and members of Congress were being used, that there would be no outcome. Because I knew that Stephen Miller, who is the chief policymaker inside the White House, would undermine every possible compromise deal between Republicans and Democrats, either on the Hill or in the U.S. Senate. And by the collaboration, cooperation, and collusion between Jeff Sessions and Stephen Miller, that nothing would ever come across the president's desk.
So what does that mean from a legislative perspective? Does that mean just never enter?
No, what it means, no. I'm not against compromise. Don't get me wrong. I'm for where you can find a deal. What I'm saying is, with the current executive administration, nothing's going to come out in terms of any type of immigration reform at all. Unless they say, okay, we'll keep you as a DACA recipient. We'll give you not permanent. We'll give you some temporary status, but we're going to deport your mother. So you say, okay, that's a Sophie's choice. I got temporary status that I can foreseeably renew, into perpetuity. But you just took my mother away from me, or you took my father away from me. So that's the kind of deals I think the White House wants to play. I think that the Republicans and Democrats in Washington have to be very careful that they don't negotiate against themselves. I'm not against compromise. Sure. I'm not against working out deals like the Lindsey Graham, Dick Durbin deal. I don't know the full details, but I'm for that. I think that you need a new White House. You're not going to get a deal on the issue of immigration, because the immigration issue is a political issue that works for this president. Any type of compromise deal on this issue takes away his juju, his mojo,
Do you
with his
think he
base.
should be impeached?
Yes, I've said that from day one. I've said that I don't know why this has to be so controversial, because by any objective measure, by any objective standard, in comparison to Richard Nixon, who this president makes him look like a choir boy, in comparison, in the break-in into Watergate hotel at the DNC headquarters, and then the cover-up pales in comparison to what is happening today. Now, if you're going to ask me, Dan, is it practical, given the makeup about the House and the Senate, and would they prosecute, in the Congress, similar to what they did to Bill Clinton? Well, on the issue of Monica Lewinsky and whether he was upfront about it or not, they moved forward quickly. They didn't hesitate for a nanosecond, although it was stopped in the U.S. Senate. They just impeached the whole Supreme Court of West Virginia. They didn't hesitate for a nanosecond. So you have people in very, very powerful political positions using political power, abusing political power in the past that has not helped bring our country together. So in this case, and be mindful about one thing. I want to go back a little bit real quickly. Had Jeb Bush won the presidency of the United States, had John Kasich, had even Chris Christie from Jersey, or Marco Rubio, for any other Republican aspirant other than Ted Cruz, had they won the presidency of the United States, even through the Electoral College system, which I think is antiquated and should be dismantled, I'd be disappointed as a Democrat and as a Californian, but more importantly, as a citizen, I'd be disappointed. But I'd get over it in a couple weeks. And then I'd try to figure out how can we find common ground with the new Republican president.
Do you think you'd be running?
No. Now I'll get back to that if you want. How can we find common ground with the new president? And well, we cannot find common ground because that's inevitable between two different political parties, and especially a state like California that is so dramatically different than the rest of the country. Well, we can't find common ground then within the parameters of normalcy, within the spirit of the American body politic. We debate our ideas. We dialogue our ideas. We even fight for our ideas. But I identify this as an abnormality from day one, and that's why, and I think it's been sort of portrayed erroneously in some circles, is that my resistance to this president would not be applicable if Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, John Kasich had won the presidency of the United States, or even Lindsey Graham. That when George W. Bush was president, there was a lot of policies that I disagree with. Chiefly one of them that you asked, or someone, was the Iraq War. But I wasn't out there asking for impeachment, and I wasn't out there asking to block everything. Ronald Reagan, when he was president of the United States, IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, a bipartisan deal that was brought together by Democrats and Republicans. The president was a Republican. I had some family members who benefited from this deal. And each time, as controversial it is always when Ronald Reagan Day is brought up on the Senate floor, and you hear the folks who support it, and you hear the Democrats, some not all, who get up, and passionately disagree with it for the reasons, which I'm very respectful of. I've always voted for, that acknowledgement and that resolution for it. But so I have worked in a very bipartisan fashion. You ask Republicans in the Senate, as well as a handful of them, a good number of them on the Assembly side, and I have worked very closely with them to find deals of commonality where we can move this state of California together. This is very different. And I just identified from day one, and the reason why is during the Republican primary, before it was defined, I saw how we treated other Republican candidates. And my viewpoint was, it didn't take a political consultant or a pollster, it was just my own moral compass. That if he treats other Republican presidential aspirants and their family members the way he does, he goes out of the way to humiliate them, to denigrate them, to dehumanize them. How do you think he's going to treat Democrats? And how do you think he's going to treat the most vulnerable among us? So that, for me, was a moral issue. And he wins the presidency, or I'm sorry, let me go back. He wins the nomination, which no one ever thought he would win the nomination. And within the tradition of presidential politics, if you're on the right and you secure the nomination, you go a little more towards the middle to try to get middle America in those key electoral college states. If you're on the left and you win the Democratic nomination, you screw more towards the middle to have a message that resonates to the most of the country, which I understand. So I actually thought naively myself that, he would start changing his message. He more than doubled down. He tripled and quadrupled down on his message that divided the country even more so. So when he wins, to everyone's surprise, through the Electoral College system on November 6th, what made my decision wasn't listen to ABC, NBC, or MSNBC, or CBS, the political pundits and the pollsters, giving their in-depth analysis of how he won. That didn't drive me. When I saw children that were crying. Who cries when the president is elected, if not from joy?
Which children were you saying?
Children. Children the following day.
Like on the street? Or?
Well, in the school. In the school. It was reported. And I've seen children who are crying. So many stories, you've heard the stories yourselves. The children were crying, not out of joy out of a historic, momentous occasion, but out of deep fear, out of a sense of panic, a sense of anxiety. When you have a first and second graders who they don't understand politics, electoral politics, but they feel something intuitively, and they feel the fear of their parents and other family parents when they're bawling their eyes out and crying. This is the United States of America. This is the greatest country in the world, and when you have children crying. So I made my decisions from day one to resist, but not just to resist for resistance sakes in a sort of a circular motion, just going around in circles and going nowhere, but resist with results that California would clearly be targeted because on the margin of 2-1, we rejected the politics fueled by resentment, by bigotry, and by misogyny. And that my intuition told me he was going to come after California. And that's why I believed it was my duty, role, and responsibility as a leader of the Senate to position the state Senate and to move forward policies that would protect our economic prosperity, our values, and our people.
So it sounds like you're saying that on the issue of immigration, it's foolish to try and find common ground with this administration. Are there any issues where you think it would not be foolish to try and find that common ground?
You know, and maybe maybe a little credit on the issue of North Korea, but the question is, I will say that the old paradigm of the foreign policy that Democrat and Republican administrations have been to try to contain and through economic sanctions and through United Nations, and that obviously hasn't worked for many years. Not that we've had any verifiable and quantifiable gains to date from North Korea in dismantling their nuclear disarmament. I will say this, by objective standard, having the leader of North Korea and the leader of the United States, come together is without question, it's extraordinary. There's no doubt about it. It is extraordinary. But that being said, I mean, he flew in, and I think he flew out the very next day. So the question is, when you have such a historic encounter with another leader who has been a pariah in the global scene, the follow-through and how you quantify, safety in that region with South Korea and Japan, and the client state being to the north of North Korea, that being China, the follow-through has not been good at all whatsoever.
All right.
Okay. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Thank
giving
you
us
very
so
much.
much of your time.
No, thank you. It was fun.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Fun.
Yeah,
It was fun.
Likewise.
All right. Thank you. Right.
Very
Okay.
helpful.
Thank you. Oh, I don't know what that means. That was loaded. Very helpful. Damn right.
Great to see you.
Thanks. It was good to see you.
All right.
I didn't get